All right, everybody, this is Laravel DFW, and this is the August 2014 meetup. So it just said live, so if it didn't go live yet, this is Laravel DFW, and this is the August 2014 meetup. So we have John Fischelli here today, and he's going to present about Angular, and I saw some of his stuff at Laracon, and it was really cool on some stuff he'd been working on, so I'm excited to hear what he has to say. We have also Osvaldo, who presented last time in June, I think is when we met last, and so Osvaldo's here, and David Hempe will jump on, and maybe a couple other people. And then if you have any questions at all, you can send them to laraveldfw.com/ask, and then that'll shoot to us, and then we can talk about it here and answer your questions. So if at any point in the conversation you have a question for John or anything really about Laravel, then just shoot it out to us and we'll answer it. So again, that's laraveldfw.com/ask. So let me just make one announcement. That's all that I got sent in, but Brian Morin is looking for a mid-level PHP developer for his startup Sam Cart. So I will post this link in the comments here on both. Let's see here. So I'm posting it in the comments on the Google event, and then I'll also post it on the meetup.com page. So if you're on meetup.com and you're not yet, go ahead and jump in and join that, because then you'll hear about all the stuff that we're doing. And so that's kind of how we schedule everything. So without further ado, check the comments for that link to Brian Morin's post. And then I guess we can get started with John. So, John, do you want to, I guess, get started?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to share my screen. You guys let me know when you can see it. And make sure I have this over there. Okay, it looks like it's working. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, hello everyone. Like Tanner said, my name is John Fischelli, and this talk is a practical look at your first Laravel and Angular app. I don't do talks like this very often. This is probably my second one ever, so any feedback, criticism, kudos, thoughts you have, please send them to me. I would love to get better at this. My Twitter handle is right there, and I just realized I don't have a mouse cursor, but you can see it right there, at John Fischelli, really creative. So just send me your thoughts, give me a follow, and let's talk about Laravel and Angular and whatever else. So this talk kind of evolved a little bit from the time that I agreed to do it to now. I took a new job, and so some of the code and some of the examples that I had hoped to talk about and show, I probably really can't show anymore. So I still think a practical look at your first Laravel and Angular app is an appropriate title, but this will be kind of an Angular primer. And then I have a real-world example that I would love to dive into some actual code and show you guys some stuff. If you already know Angular, this talk might be a little basic, but if you don't know Angular at all or are coming at it with having never used it before, hopefully you will learn something, and hopefully I do too. So some goals I had for this. Just want to give you guys the absolute basics on Angular and kind of demystify it a little bit. At least for me, it was very confusing for a while. I kind of knew what it was, but I didn't really know how to use it or when it was appropriate. So hopefully we'll straighten some of that stuff out. Obviously, real-life examples are incredibly helpful, so hopefully we will look at a couple of those. And then I have some resources that were absolutely invaluable to me, getting me to where I am now with Angular. So I want to share those with you guys as well, so that you can, if you want to, start down that path as well. Encouragement, if I can do this, I know that's a very cliche thing to say, but seriously, if I can, anyone else can. So hopefully that encourages you guys. And then I'm really hoping to learn how to do these kinds of things. So it should be a good teaching example for myself. So qualifications. I am not terribly qualified. I've been, I'm not by any means a thought leader in the web development industry. I'm just a guy, and I'm just a guy learning Angular. And so I just want to kind of share my experience, and just want to share how I understand Angular today. I'm sure it will change. I'm sure it'll grow, but hopefully I can get everyone started. So actually, seriously, my qualifications, I've been a developer for about 7 years, using Laravel for about 18 months, and then Angular for around 8 months. I started at the beginning of the year. And I made a bunch of really messy apps with jQuery, and that kind of is what started me down the path of, hey, there should be a better way, and it turns out that there is. And so, yeah. So then, why Angular? I thought that was maybe important to go over. There are lots of other alternatives out there, Ember and Backbone probably being the major two. And some of these are libraries, some of these are actual frameworks. But the important thing to note here really is just that I just picked one, and Angular happened to be it. So this talk is going to focus primarily on Angular, but it's not meant to be, hey, you should use Angular, it's the only thing out there, or it's better than all of the others. That's not at all my motivation. It's just the one that I know. And they all have different strengths and weaknesses. But once I picked Angular and I started to learn more about it, there actually were a couple of philosophies that I thought were really cool and lined up well with Laravel. One of them being testing. So Laravel kind of comes set up for some testing stuff out of the box. Angular is very similar in that thought process that you should be writing tests. I don't know too much about that, so in this simple example I have tonight, we won't be covering that, but it's a very similar kind of philosophy between the two. And then the other one would be that Angular, I think, is more open-ended than Ember or Backbone as far as how you do things. And I think Laravel is very open-ended as far as how you do things. So it's kind of a framework to do things, and then it kind of gets out of your way, and I think Angular is very similar. That can be a really positive and kind of a negative thing as you're learning, because there's really not one set right way to do one thing. So my encouragement there would be to just start using it and don't worry too much about doing it the right way. You'll kind of learn that as you go. So there are a couple of other things that I really liked about Angular that I thought set it apart from Ember and Backbone that I wanted to cover. And this is coming at it from very little knowledge about Ember and Backbone. So if there are similar concepts in Ember and Backbone or any of these other frameworks, then I apologize, but I wasn't intimately familiar with them. But one of the things I liked about Angular was when you're building controllers and other things like that, you actually don't inherit from like a base Ember controller or a Backbone model or collection, I think is what they're called. You're actually working with plain old JavaScript. They're just plain JavaScript objects that you're working with. So it made more sense. I didn't have like another public API to learn of like what can a controller do. Basically anything you can do with JavaScript object in Angular, you can do it in Angular. So I really like that. And then dependency injection, studying that in Laravel, that concept exists here in Angular, and maybe it exists in Ember and Backbone too. I actually don't know that for sure, but the fact that it exists in Angular really kind of helped, I guess, maybe help me take it to a level above beginner, because I can inject things that I needed into an Angular controller, and we'll kind of look at more what that looks like and what that really means as we move along. And then there's another philosophy in Angular that I really liked, and it's that a developer should be able to look at the HTML of your Angular app and start to get an idea of what's going on. And so I have an example of that, and I really hope that you guys can see this. Tanner, is this clear enough? Because I can probably pull this up in my code editor if it's not.
We can see it, I think.
I can see it good.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So starting at the top, these double brackets, the very first paragraph says it's got GS name in double brackets. And so that's just basically outputting a value from the controller right there in the HTML. And we'll come back to why that's really cool in a little bit when we get into the data binding part. So you can see that there is a GS object in my controller. So you can go look at what that is. You can see it has a name and a hotel property. And then jumping down a little bit more to the first list item there, we're going to encounter what is our first, these are called directives. And really a directive is just a custom HTML attribute. There's a little bit more to directives than just attributes, but for right now, I'll kind of leave it at that. But this ng-repeat is kind of our first directive to encounter in this example. And what that is doing is it's actually looping through the gs.itinerary property, which is just an array. And it's assigning each iteration to the place value. And then going down a little bit more, you can see that we're actually outputting the place title. And we even have another nested repeat where we're repeating through all the terms for a place. So I know this is probably kind of weird because you don't know exactly what I'm talking about yet, but we'll come back to this. And of course, this is an actual snippet from the example that I have today. So hopefully it'll all make sense here shortly.
Really, I have one question, John.
Yes.
So can you go over just one more time really quick on what the GS is? Is that for your well, yeah, can you just go over again what that's doing?
Yes, so the GS is a custom object I created just to group some data together because it made sense to me. And it just relates back to, we'll see more in the example, but this is actually an itinerary. So an itinerary for a trip to a specific city, and the idea is that you can basically get a bunch of places that you want to visit. We'll build this itinerary, you give the itinerary a name, you pick out the hotel that you're staying at, you're picking the date that you're traveling to this city, and we're saving this data for you so that you can come back and get to it later. So you're kind of planning your trip. And the GS object is just the object that I'm using to store the data that the user has given me. We'll go, again, you'll see that much more in the example that when we actually get to the real life coding part. But I can't, at least at the moment, I don't know how to explain it much more than that. But
cool, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful. Anyway, jumping down to, at the very bottom of this, the second list item in here, we have another directive called ng-show. The ng-show directive basically evaluates the statement inside that little directive right there. And if it is true, it will show that item, or sorry, it'll show that HTML element. And if it's false, it'll hide it. And so that's going to kind of give you, if you have the basics of Angular down, you can start looking at HTML of an Angular app and really start to see what is going on, because it's not all hidden away inside the controller or other layers of your application. It's actually right in your view. And so I found this really helpful to. And I thought it was just a really kind of a cool philosophy that Angular had, is that you should be able to look at HTML that you're already familiar with and kind of figure out what's going on. Hopefully I'm doing this justice. But we'll come back to all of this here in a second. So what I wanted to do now is just kind of cover when you should use Angular. This is just in my opinion. Maybe there are differing opinions or even better opinions. But if you've ever built an app, a client-side app with jQuery, my thought is you probably should have used Angular, because jQuery's, I think anything of any kind of complexity, you'll realize it gets to be kind of a mess really, really quickly. In fact, in my opinion, jQuery, as great as it is for manipulating the DOM, when you're wanting to build actual applications with it, I think it starts to break down really quickly because you're constantly trying to keep your UI in sync with what's happening with your JavaScript layer, which is kind of my second bullet point there. If you've ever struggled with that of, how do I keep my UI how do I represent what's happening in my app in my UI, and then someone interacts with my UI, and now my app, my JavaScript layer needs to know what's happened. That's a dead giveaway, in my opinion, that you should be using a framework like Ember or Angular, because what you need is actually what's called data binding, which we'll get to in a little bit. And then actually, we'll move on to the next slide, because I think that's pretty much everything on this one. So I also struggled at first with Angular. I struggled with how to classify what it is. I I was very familiar with MVC, and that makes a lot of sense to me. And so Angular is MVC-like, and so I try to classify it in an MVC paradigm. I find that to be really useful. It helps me understand the parts of Angular a little bit better when I can say, okay, this is a controller, this is a view, this is a model. And when it comes to client-side apps, models were typically where I was being tripped up. Like, to me, a model meant database server. And so I was like, how in the world does that even exist in a client-side application? And so I've done up a little example here. And this is really rough. I hope you guys don't mind this. But it's actually not code. It's more of a visual example of how Angular interacts with an HTML page. And I think it's a really good foundation for understanding what Angular is doing. So let's consider that you have an HTML page, and it's just a blank page right now. And let's say that you add a header div, and then you add a body div, or a content div. Using directives in Angular, which again are just HTML attributes, you can convert your body div into a view. So you're basically telling Angular, and we'll look at what this actually looks like in code soon, but you're telling Angular that this is actually a view. And then, I'm sorry? Okay, I'll keep going. I thought someone had a question. So you make this a view, and then in your JavaScript side of Angular, you can declare a router. This is a router just like you would have with Laravel, where it kind of maps URLs to states of your application. And you could tell this router, hey, on my home page, I want you to inject an HTML partial into my view. And so you can do that. And then at the same time, with the router, you can say, okay, that HTML partial and that view, they also need a controller that goes with them. And that controller could load data from an API or from your server, and then you render that data into that HTML view. And what's really cool about that is that once you have those set up, your view and your controller kind of share data seamlessly. There is no more need for you to I guess target, and we'll get into this a little bit more too. This kind of goes back to data binding, but there's no need for you to select an element with jQuery and get its value so that you can do something with it. You actually use, let's say you have a form in your HTML, and it has just a name and an email field. These are actual input fields. You can again use directives on these input fields to declare them as models. And what that'll do is that'll make that data instantly available in your controller. And so as users begin typing in their name, your controller is aware of that input coming in. And you can then use that data to send it to the server for persistence or storage or do something with it. And what's really cool about this is that if something, if they click on a button in your application somewhere else in your HTML, and your controller modifies the name or the email value, that modification, whatever that is, maybe you check their name to ensure that it's uppercase or something like that. That change would then be reflected back into your document through data binding. So your models really become, or a model in a client-side application is really kind of the input that a user would give you, and it tends to be the data that you would post to a server for persistence. And what was just really mind-blowing for me is that models exist inside the view, and they're not separate from that. So when I finally started to understand that, it started to make a lot more sense, because I think honestly for me that was the biggest hurdle of, okay, Angular's MVC. I understand MVC from a server-side perspective. What does that look like on a client side? And so I really hope that that example will get you guys started on understanding this as well, because that's the best way I know how to explain it for the moment. And then, of course, I have two more bullets at the bottom here. Data binding makes getting values to post to the server really easily. And the best way I can explain that is you don't have to use jQuery to target some input element and get its value. Data binding makes that model's value instantly available in your controller, and vice versa. So that's really cool. So looking at this first example that you've seen again, you're actually seeing data binding at work here. Anywhere you see those double brackets and you see the gs.name and then gs.hotel, we're actually outputting values from the controller, and our HTML is not aware of when those values change. Angular kind of helps maintain that for us and just update the view whenever those values are updated. So really, really handy for that. I'm going to stop the presentation for a second, or stop my slides rather, and jump into a real-life example. And I picked out this GIF because as I was practicing this talk, I always tripped up on this part. So if there's ever a time that this could get a little shaky, it'll be right here. So your patience is appreciated, and hopefully this all goes great.
Hey, while you're pulling that across, let me just remind everybody that if you have a question in any of this, just go to laraveldfw.com/ask, and then we can get to questions now or later, whenever we get to them. We'll definitely have some time at the end, but just send them in right now while it's fresh in your head, so laraveldfw.com/ask.
Yes, please send them in. That would be awesome. Okay, so what I have here is this little example app that I've created. It's being served up with Laravel, and it's got an Angular front end here. And it was kind of what I was mentioning before, is the idea behind this is that we are creating an itinerary for you to come visit a specific city, and the itinerary would consist of just like areas or places of interest that you might want to visit. And so an itinerary, you would want to name your itinerary, because the idea is you could save several itineraries and view them later. And of course, you need to know where you're staying as far as hotel goes. So we'll be able to provide a hotel name, and then of course you want to put in the dates that you're coming to a city. And so what's really cool about this is that we actually have areas of interest, and you rate them, and then based on your rating, we're going to build an itinerary of things you might like to do. So I wanted you to see kind of from a front-end perspective what we're doing, and then I was going to jump into the code here in just a second and kind of show you how this works. So actually, let me show you. This is an example of data binding here. So I have this name field bound as a model, and you're going to see this as I begin typing here. It's automatically going to start appearing with whatever I'm typing right over here. Or right above that, sorry. So this will be, this is my new trip. You can see as I was typing that data began to appear right here. Now there's no jQuery listening to this input element. This is all Angular data binding that's really reading in the value of this, and then it's constantly updating itself to say, okay, the user has updated this model, and so even though the model is being requested in the HTML, I know that I need to go ahead and just output whatever the current value of that model is. And then for the hotel, I'll just say we're staying at the Sheraton. So you can see, if you remember back from the first example we were showing, we were actually outputting GS name and GS hotel, and you're seeing that in action right here. And then, of course, we'll set a arrival date and a departure date. And then what I wanted to show you here is we're going to pull some itinerary items now by rating our interest. And all of this data is coming from a Laravel database, and so we can look a little bit more about how we did that. So I'll just go ahead and say, yeah, sports and outdoors, I'll rate that a 4. This is all randomized data, so it doesn't make sense from a sports and outdoor perspective, because I don't have actual data for that. And the images that you're seeing here are actually coming from a service called Lorem Pixel, so they're going to kind of be the same too. And I realized I used to show the actual term. That would kind of, we'll do that too. Maybe in our example, I'll put the term of the current, so you can see that this is actually sports and outdoor stuff. But as we begin to rate other interests, these will start to change. So you can see they're automatically changing as I scroll this. And so this is that GS itinerary array that I kind of mentioned in the beginning, and it's basically just filled out with a bunch of data down there. So I can now save that itinerary, and that actually posts all this data to the server. And this next view you're going to see is actually not Angular, but I did just want to show you that we're saving all that data. And again, it's all randomized, so you're seeing all sorts of random latitude and longitudes. But here are all those places of interest that we've saved. And of course, you can see the Sheraton Hotel name was saved, and then this is my new trip, and these are the 2 dates. So this is not a completed app by any means. I actually left the company where I was working on this app. So you're seeing the code base as it was a couple of months ago. I'm sure it's moved on from this, but I did feel like I could probably show this and use this as my more simplified example of making Angular work. Let's go ahead and actually dive into how I set this page up so that you can get a sense of that. So again, I hope this is big enough that you guys can see this. But this is my just standard Laravel install. And I'll start by going straight to the router so you can see a little bit more about this. So the homepage route, so if we go back to the app real quick, you can see, oh, excuse me, go back to the homepage. That's actually not a route. The homepage here, itgen app, actually loads our Angular page. So what I wanted to do was show you that here. So here's my homepage route, and you can see it returns a pages.generator view. So I'll jump over to that. And I'll open that up. So this is the HTML that's declared our Angular app. And what I wanted to get across with this part was that you can actually serve the HTML with Laravel, and the HTML actually is what starts up Angular. Or you could configure your web server to serve an index.html file first and put that in your public directory and work with your Angular code completely outside of a Laravel install. It's really up to you how you want to do it. I actually like having Laravel take the initial request and then load whatever HTML I need, because I've actually written Angular apps where I needed to load completely different HTML for a mobile view, and so it was just really convenient to have Laravel detect as the client on a mobile device or on a desktop, and then completely switch out the HTML that I was using. What's really cool about that as well is that you can reuse your controller logic and just switch out your HTML, because a lot of stuff is powered by directives. You don't have to have the exact same HTML. Of course, Dropbox would start updating. You don't have to have the exact HTML. Well, it just makes it a lot easier. But you can abstract what is unique to a desktop maybe into your directives for your desktop, and then abstract what's unique to maybe your mobile view of your app into your HTML for your app, and switch out what it needs with Laravel. So it's really, really nice to do that. And I have an example of that too. So if we have time and interest, I'd be happy to show that. So this is just your average HTML page, and at the very root of the HTML element, we are actually declaring, and hopefully this is becoming clear to you that this is actually, I'll make this much bigger so that you can see this. This is a directive, of course I moved it, ng app, and that's basically telling Angular that, hey, we're going to have an app inside this HTML element. We're not declaring a view yet. We're just letting Angular know that it's going to need to load. I believe that it's possible to have more than one Angular app actually active on a single page at a time. I have not done that myself, and I don't know if there's a huge use case for it, but you could move this directive down lower into your HTML document if you needed to. And then I'm just loading Modernizer and Typekit, nothing crazy there. This is a normal Laravel include just to pull in the nav, and then just a ton of HTML here. But if we go down a little bit further, you can see that I declared a view right here with this directive, UI view itinerary details. So I basically have named a view in Angular, and I'm going to be able to now target that view with my router and inject more HTML into it, and then also instantiate a controller, which would mean that I could do whatever I wanted to with that data. So I want to jump back to this really quick and just let you know that where we are in the HTML right here, itinerary details, that is the view that I called this little area right here. And before I go much further, I wanted to take a step back and let you know that by default, Angular only allows you to declare one view in your application. And I find that a little bit limiting, especially when you want to do like fancy animations. Like let's say you want to animate other parts of your app in and let people interact with them once they've completed a step or something like that. And you don't want them to lose maybe the data that they've already entered in. That's where multiple views come in. Whereas by default, if Angular only has one view in your app, it's just switching HTML in and out of that view, and it's loading and unloading controllers. And so your user will lose the some of the state that they've achieved with your app. So I have a better example of that. I'll actually pull this up really quick. And this is another local site. This is a more complete Angular app. It was too complex for me to use it as the example where we actually look at HTML because there's just too much going on. And it should be loading. There we go. Okay. So the idea behind this little app was that you could filter trails that you could go hike by difficulty or location or distance. But what we wanted to do with the UI was something really cool. We didn't want you to kind of lose your state of where you were. So if you clicked on, it's easy difficulty, we automatically just animate in all of the results that match that. And of course, these filters stack. So you could say, I want to see easy trails in Palm Springs. And so you can see that this data is being added up here as the active filters. And then distance, I want only 1 to 5 miles. So we've now narrowed down the set of trails that we have. And you can click on a single trail to actually see its view. And I'm sorry, for some reason on my local Homestead install, it seems to be a lot slower than it should be. But we give you the name of the trail. We're giving you some metadata about the trail. But we didn't want you to lose where you were in your application. So you can go back, and we've maintained all of this state. I actually set this up with the default Angular router first and realized that I was losing, every time I went to a trail detail, I was losing that data. And so people they'd filter down to a specific trail and then they would be lost. They couldn't get back to they had to redo those filters all over again. So what I do, and we'll see this at the bottom of this page, so I've declared a view here and then 2 other views right here. And these views match up to what you're seeing right here. This is the controls view, and this is the results view, and so you can see UI view controls view and UI view results view. I actually use a third-party router that you can install with Angular, and it'll replace the built-in default Angular router. And it's by the Angular team, and it's called Angular UI Router, and I think I have a link to it. Otherwise, maybe some questions, something like that, I can link you guys to this. But I highly recommend learning this. It's a lot more complex, but with that complexity comes a lot more power, I think, for your applications. And it really, I think, allows you to do some really cool, like animating things in as you travel through your app. So we've declared our 3 views up here. We've included jQuery for our date picker, nothing more. And then we've included the Angular core file. Sanitize and animate, I'm actually not using those. Sanitize just like cleans data that's inputted from the user, and animate I'm actually not using at all. I was playing with it, so we can skip over that for a moment. I'm including the new router, and then everything below this is really unique Angular code to my application. And so I'm doing a couple of things. You can see I've separated my controllers and my directives into their own folders. This actually JS scripts min. I'm going to move this down a little bit because it is unique only to that page, and it doesn't have anything to do with Angular. So I'll just get that out of the way. So we are, and I'll open these files up because this is not telling you too much yet. But what you're going to be able to see is that I'm declaring variables in this idgen module.js that I actually extend in these other JS files. And that's what this angular.module function is doing. You can see right here that I've declared a module called itgen constants. Itgen is the short name that I kind of gave my itinerary generator, as I called it, which is what this app was. And you can see that this stuff is not in its own JS file because this actually is coming from Laravel itself. So in order to post data back to the server, I needed to know if the user was logged in and what their user ID was. And then I also needed a CSRF token. But what's really cool about this is I can inject these constants into my controllers so that it makes that stuff really easy. This kind of goes back to one of the slides I had in the beginning, which talked about dependency injection in Angular, and it was a really valuable tool for being able to share data across different parts of your application. That becomes more and more important as you use the UI router and you create multiple views, and you have multiple controllers going at one time. You need to abstract things away like this so that you can inject them into the controller so that they can share that data. Because by default, an Angular controller cannot share data with another controller. You have to abstract it into a service, inject that service into each controller, and then you can share data between them. So I had to abstract basically everything into that GS service that you guys saw in the HTML, because I have 3 different views and 3 different controllers, and yeah, so in order to output the name of the itinerary over here, I had to bind the itinerary to a service, or sorry, bind the itinerary name to that GS service, and then I could inject that service into each controller and then have data for both of them. So again, my second itinerary, you can see as I begin to type, that data is filled in right there. So let's go ahead and dive into our Angular data a little bit more. Right here, itgenmodule.js, I'll open that up. I store all of the Angular stuff directly in the public directory of a Laravel install, because obviously it needs to be accessible by the web. So we'll jump into itgen.module.js really quick. So I'll pull that up. And I'm going to zoom this out a little bit so you can see a little bit more. But what I did is I created this variable called itgen_app. And I declared another Angular module, and I just called it itgen. And you'll notice that some of my other modules are being injected here. You haven't seen where these are declared yet. I'll show them to you. But the important thing here is that I'm telling Angular that my itgen module, which matches up with my, of course I closed that. I'll open up the pages.generator view. I'm telling Angular that the itgen module and the itgen app are one and the same here. So Angular knows to bind my application that I'm creating here onto this page, essentially. So I'm telling Angular that my application requires that new router, which replaces the default router that comes in, and I'm telling it I'm using ng-animate, ng-sanitize. Again, I'm not really using those in this example, but I thought I might use them, so I actually bound them in. But I'm binding in my controllers, my services, my directives, and then of course my constants. And so we'll look at each of those files in unison here in a second as well. But what I did want to do is jump down a little bit more and just talk about my router. So this is my Angular router. And you'll notice that I'm extending, again, the Angular app that I defined up here. And I'm injecting a state provider and a URL router provider. And the state provider is the object that is provided by this UI router. So the third party, well, it's not really third party, it's just an alternative router that Angular has provided for just having a little bit more power and control. And so what is unique about this is you have to stop thinking of your application in terms of pages, but rather states within a page, because single page apps kind of by nature don't really refresh the whole page. So you can have unique URLs and routes for different states of your application. But what's also really cool about this provider, this UI router, is that you actually don't have to have unique URLs. It's entirely up to you. And I'll show you an example of that. If we jump back to that, I should have left it up, but the GPS app that I showed you before, you saw that we went through several states. You kind of have the initial homepage state, and then you have sort of like a filtered results state, and then you have like an individual view of a trail. All of those are individual states that I declared, so if you'll notice the URL up here does not actually update when I jump to the results state. So that's kind of an example of how you kind of have to really separate the routes of your application and start thinking more about states of your application. And you can, of course, have a unique URL for each one if you want to, but you have that. Again, that kind of goes back to Angular. There's not one set way of doing things. There's a bunch of different ways of doing things, which I think lines up with Laravel pretty well. I'm going to go ahead and close this resolve for a moment. All this is telling the router to do is make sure that some data is available before it loads the view. Because everything in a client-side app in Angular is asynchronous, you could actually load your view before the data is available. And so this resolve thing just makes sure that I get the data that I need before loading all the data from my app. So, but jumping down a little bit, I've named this state. So I extend the state provider, I declare a state, and I call it the index state. And I could declare other states. My app is actually simple enough that I don't do that in this case. But what I want to let you know is that I'm actually calling this the index state. That's important because when you have multiple states, you can actually use directives to link directly to another state. What's cool about that is that Angular will automatically update the route URL, whatever it should be. It will automatically resolve any dependencies or any data that's needed. It'll load that data in, and then it'll load all of the views and then instantiate all of the controllers for you. So Angular is doing a ton of work behind the scenes by just declaring a state and resolving some data and then basically injecting some HTML partials and then creating controllers for each one. So what I did here, if you remember, we'll jump back to the generator real quick. We declared 3 views, itinerary details right there, the controls view and the results view. And I basically, in the views part of my state provider, I declared each of those views, which you can see. And then inside each view, I gave it a template URL, and those map to a directory in my public directory called partials, and I have controls, details, and results, and so you can see I'm actually loading that data in right there. And we'll look at each of those in a second, but then I also load a controller for each one. So you're probably wondering, well, where are these controllers defined? And if you remember, I told Angular that my itgen app requires my itgen controllers module that I'm going to create. So I'll jump over to inside my generator folder. I'll jump to the controllers.js file. And again, up at the top of this, I declare a new itgen controllers. And you'll notice that it's another Angular module called itgen.controllers, and it doesn't have any dependencies. And then I extend this module that I've declared with the controller method, and I'm able to create my details controller and then inject in some stuff that I actually need. And I actually don't even need that function, so I'll get rid of that. So let's look at this details controller a little bit more. I injected two things, a scope variable and a generator service. Now the scope variable is very important because the scope variable is what is bound into your view. So you'll notice that I extend the scope variable, give it a property called JS, which you remember seeing in my HTML, and I make it equal to the generator service, and we'll look at that generator service. But when I highlight this, you can see that it's also being injected into my other controllers the same way. And that's where I was declaring, that goes back to when I said you have to abstract, when you have multiple views in a single state and you have a controller for each view, you actually have to abstract the data that you want showing across, that you want shared between all those controllers into a service so that you can then inject it into each one. So that's what you're seeing right here. And then my controls controller, I basically do the exact same thing. I inject a scope. I inject a couple of other things, window and timeout. We'll get to that. And then but there's my generator service again. So we'll go look at that here in just a second. But you can also declare a function on your scope, which is what I did here, called save itinerary. And I want to show you where that maps to on our HTML. So I'll jump to this is my controls controller, so I'll open up the controls.html. If I go down to the very bottom, I actually have an ng-click directive on basically my save button, and it runs a function called save itinerary. Now again, remember the scope variable from your controller, this scope variable right here, is automatically bound into your view, so you don't have to prefix this and say scope itinerary, but it's the exact same thing. So you can just say itinerary. So that means if you read this directive, ng-click, I mean, that kind of is self-explanatory. That means when someone clicks on this button Angular is going to run the save itinerary function on this controller. So if I go look at my controls controller, the save itinerary function is going to look at the generator service .submitted property and see whether or not the current itinerary should be saved. It's going to make a request to save that itinerary. So I have the function that actually posts to the server is called submit, and it's on the generator service itself. And so I just load, this is a JavaScript promise basically, and we'll look at this a little more detail. But if it was successful, I then basically decide what to do. And in this case, I redirect people to view their itinerary, which you remember once we saved that itinerary, we were redirected to another page to actually view that itinerary data. And then I have a function down here called generate. And I want to explain this a little bit more because if you remember, as we actually drag these items, and as these inputs, or rather these models change, data is being, Angular is doing something, and that's what this generate function is doing. And so right here, let's look at the HTML really quick. You'll see that on my inputs, and we'll just go to the top, so we can start at the top. Sports and outdoors. Here's my input. And you'll notice that ngModel is equal to really gs.controls.sports and outdoors. I'm binding the value of this input directly into that GS model again, which if you remember is my generate service. And then I'm using another directive, ngChange. Anytime that this input is changing, I'm actually running that function on the controller. So that function is right here, is generate. And actually, to keep that from running every second, you could drag these inputs dozens of times really fast. I don't want the function to be running that much, so I have this timeout. If we go back to my Sublime text, that's what this timeout function is doing. It's just making sure that this only runs once every half second, just to kind of not waste resources. And you can see that what's happening is it's running the generate function on the GS, which is the generator service, which again was bound into this controller up here at the top. So I think it's probably time to look at this generator service because we keep talking about it. We haven't looked at it yet. So I'll jump over to that. It's in itgen, it's in services, and then right here, I again declare another Angular module called itgen services. And the reason you're doing that is this is what allows you to kind of break up your Angular app into multiple JavaScript files because you know that generally, you don't pollute the global, the window scope or the global scope of JavaScript, but Angular provides you a way to do that with declaring modules, so that your Angular app, which is declared in my itgen module right here, knows to go get those other files and to load them. So we'll jump back to services.js, and Basically, I'll go into more. I don't have much detail about this. I probably should have now that I look back more through it. But you can just extend the module that you create with this factory function. And what that lets you do is basically create a plain JavaScript object that can be shared between other parts of your controller. So this generator service, I know there's all this fancy markup around it here, code around it. It's really only creating a JavaScript object that I inject everywhere throughout my application. Now, my JavaScript object has a couple of dependencies. It has another service called the data service, which is at the bottom of this file. We'll get to that. It needs the window element. It needs timeout, sanitize. HTTP is a core Angular library for sending HTTP requests to a server. And then you can see that I injected those constants, if you remember, that I declared from my generator, CSRF token and user ID. If we come back to this, again, you're seeing that Angular module is really important there because Angular automatically, interprets itgen constants and knows that there's two constants, their name, user ID, and CSRF token, and PHP is actually outputting the values for those, and then I can inject those into my Angular app, which I'm doing right here. And this is just a helper method for determining if something's in an array. So no real magic there. We'll talk about the generated service a little bit more. So what it's responsible for doing, it's responsible for getting data from the data service, It's determining that we're going to limit the number of results for an itinerary to 10, and then it's binding. And I kind of have comments here. This object maps to a range input in the controls portion of the app. Its property is to store the current value of the input for that control. So what's happening is as I drag the sports and outdoor range element, this value here is being updated to whatever the current value is, sports and outdoor, in this case 4. And then we come down here, and there is a bunch of helper functions, and really the only one that's really helpful here is the generate function. So there's a bunch of math that goes into determining how many, we always want to have 10 itineraries, and we are basically doing a weighted average here. So I've got 10 itinerary items that I want to show, but I've only rated sports and outdoors 4 and only nightlife 3. So how do you figure out how many sports and outdoor ones that you want to see versus how many nightlife ones you want to see? And so that's what this generate function is doing. It's basically weighting the average of these inputs and clearing out any existing itinerary items. And then it's looping through them and determining how many itinerary items we need for each area of interest, and then it's pushing them onto an array. So instead of focusing on the math and the code that makes this happen, I think what's more important here is to realize that you're actually just pushing these JavaScript items onto this itinerary property, which, if you remember when we looked at our HTML, again, I actually looped through that with an ng repeat directive and output that data. So really, that's all the generate function is doing. I even randomize it. I just randomize the values of that array. And then this was something just for my app, so nothing to worry about there. And then I wrote some other other helper methods, like clearing out an itinerary, that I could use in my controller if I had a reset button, which I actually do right here. Again, let's make sure we know what controller we're in. So we're in the controls controller, which if I jump back to my app, there's a restart button right here, which should clear out the application right there. And I actually forgot to make it reset those input values, so it's not doing that just yet. But you can see it erased all of the data from from my generator service. Let's talk about how it did that. So again, I declared a reset function on my controller scope, and if I go into my controls.html and go down to the bottom, there is a reset button, and you can see, again, using the same directives you've seen before, ng-click, it runs the reset function on my controller. The reset function on my controller runs the reset function on my generator service, which that actually, if I go into services and let's find reset, you can see that all it's doing is setting all those values back to null. And so Angular is handling all of the grunt work of updating my UI. I didn't have to erase that. I didn't have to target this input with jQuery and tell it to now be a have a blank value. Angular figures all of that out with data binding, and that's what's, I think, just really, really cool. The first time I really figured out and used data binding, I was just like, wow, it's magic. I didn't really know how else to explain it. So let's see, what else could we talk about with this? Let's look back at the partials, the results view again. So now that you've seen the app from the JavaScript layer perspective, this is the initial, it's been changed slightly, but this is the initial code snippet that I showed you guys, where I was trying to declare or trying to explain what data binding actually is. And so hopefully this makes more sense now that you've seen the generator service and you've seen the controllers kind of at work. I know it's a lot of information really fast. I tried to show a really cool real-world example, but then the more it is, the more it's harder to kind of fit it all in. But this is just outputting the value of gs.name, whatever it is. So literally the code you're seeing right here is all the code that it took to get this functionality right here, where I type in my first item. That is automatically updating down right here. You can see we're doing that same thing for hotel. So here's my, and this is where the ng repeat is. So again, it's looping through anything in GS itinerary. And so if that itinerary, which again is just property on the generator service, if that's an empty array, it jumps down to the bottom list item right here and says, show this text, no itinerary item selected, through the use of this ng show directive. So you can see that's what's happening right now because there is no data in that array because my generator service generate function has not been run because no one has changed an input recently. So as I begin to just automatically change that, it's automatically figuring out data to put into that array. And because data is going into that array, Angular is automatically rendering it because I have an ng repeat statement right here. And then, of course, the data of that particular place is just what all of this HTML inside is doing. So it's kind of a complex topic, but I hope that it's starting to become clear. The more that I've kind of worked on this, I don't know, there's just so much to cover with Angular, but I'm hoping that between my slides and, of course, this, that you kind of get a feel for how it's working. So Tanner, this would probably be a good time if anyone has submitted a question or if there's anything that wasn't clear for you guys that are watching it. If there's something I can answer, I think now would probably be a good time to do so.
Sure.
So,
yeah, so we'll just take some questions now for sure. I know that there's at least 2 or 3. And so if you have any questions, again, laraveldfw.com/ask. So Stuart, I know you had one and Osvaldo had one. So who wants to go first?
I'll go ahead.
hey, Stuart.
Hey, how's it going? So I kind of had a question about, so if you're using Laravel as your persistence layer to just keep your data stored in the database,
Yes.
would you, and I know it kind of depends on the situation, but I'm curious in times that you've done it, do you save that entire JSON JavaScript object in just a blob in the database to just retrieve back and forth, or do you have or do you always have it in its own, do I
break
columns?
it into a model? Yeah. That's a great question. I'm glad you brought it up because I did want to talk about that side of the app because I think that's probably the part that's missing for you guys. So before we do that, let's look back at our services. Of course, if I could spell it correctly. Right here, and let's look at our generator service, and I believe I have a function called submit. Okay, so what it does is I have a submit function on my generator service that basically, and you can kind of read this here, HTTP dot post, it posts to a URL in my application itinerary save. And it's basically posting the return from this sanitize function, which all that's doing right here is it's building a JavaScript object, and it's got the name, the date of arrival, the date of departure, the hotel, the itinerary, which you can see is actually that array. So the itinerary property of the generator service is an array of places. So that's what is also being posted, and then token and user ID are being posted as well. So all of that goes to itinerary save. So why don't we look at that? And exactly the thought that you had about storing the JSON object as a blob in the database, that's exactly what I did. At first, I was actually just serializing the array and then trying to save it in a blob. But from what I read and discovered, it seemed like storing it as JSON was a little more, was a little better. So I recommend doing that. I actually can't remember exactly why off the top of my head. I think that there's a way that you can lose some data when you serialize it and try and store it. I'm not as up to date on that as I probably should be. But so yeah, I was storing the JSON directly into a blob field on my table. So we'll do that too. Let's open up SQL Pro so that you can see the database for this. And then we'll also look at the routes in Angular that achieve this. So Homestead, and it was the itgen. And there's a lot more to this app than just what I've shown there, but here's my itineraries. Here's my itineraries table. This is where all that data is saved to. So you can see that I actually store the user ID that submitted it, and then, of course, I'm generating a slug from the name of their itinerary, and I'm just appending some random characters to the end of it to make sure that they don't collide. And then here's all the data. This is basically the JSON data that's being posted from Angular. So this is exactly how I stored it. And you can see right here that it was a blob field that I stored it in. So I actually have a matching model on the server side called itinerary. And it belongs to users. So I'm using Eloquent, just as in the course you can see I'm extending Eloquent. So I'm using kind of core, Laravel stuff. And then if we look at routes, you can see that I have a itinerary save route declared right here, and it maps to itinerary controller and the save function. So we'll open that up, controllers, itinerary, and save right here. So my save function just gathers the input that's posted. And then, of course, I just get the user ID, put that into a variable. I'm creating a blank array of places. So what I'm doing right there is, or what I'm doing right here is looping through that itinerary value that was posted. If you remember, the itinerary property on the generator service was just an array of data. So I'm basically getting the ID of all of the places. Now this was an important challenge I had was, do I save those itinerary items as they were in that moment, or do I re-pull them from the database later on? And the reason I re-pulled them from the database was I figured that the people managing the site that I was building, of course I'm not working on it anymore, would go into their places database and update that data. And so I wanted people to get the latest version of that. So I actually only stored the ID of the place instead of the full place data. So what I mean by that is, this Yoast and Sons is a place which places have their own model and their own table and all that type of stuff. So I just save the ID reference to it, and every time I build the itinerary, I just go retrieve those places. So that's what all this is doing, and then I unset the token and the user ID field from my input array, because what I do is just encode it, and then that's what I save into the blob, and I didn't see any reason to. I've already got the user ID in its own column. I didn't see any reason to resave that. And of course, the CSRF token has a one-time use, basically, so there's no reason to save that. And then I actually have, this is a little more complicated than it probably should be. I actually have a way that people can view an itinerary without being logged into their application or to this application. And what it would do is would take them immediately. It wouldn't save anything in database. It would just redirect them to that view screen that we saw earlier where you could view an itinerary. So ignoring that for the moment, which is all that code right there, basically, I build an itinerary from the input, and then I save that itinerary to the database, and then I build a response, and then I return that response to Angular, which can then decide what to do with it. And I believe in my, so then that jumps back to my save itinerary function. So that submit function is what fired off that post request. Laravel's itinerary save route picks all of that data up, runs all of that logic, responds. That's what goes into the save variable, and then I can basically inspect that response, and if it includes a slug, then I redirect them to view their itinerary and just append the slug into the URL there. And then, of course, in my routes again, I have too much stuff open here. Let's go back into my routes. I have the itinerary view slug route. So my viewing a saved itinerary page actually does not include Angular. It's just a default Laravel route. So it views the slug, and we'll open that up really quick. It maps to itinerary controller at view, just so you can see that. And views right here. So it again, I had a way where people could view an itinerary without saving it. I was saving it to the session, so ignoring that for the moment. It retrieves an itinerary that matches the slug from the URL, decodes the data, builds, reloads that data from those places, and then loads their metadata, which was all of the like address stuff and that type of stuff, and then it binds it into a view. So it makes a template global, nests the pages.view, and then binds all that data in. So that was kind of how I tackled the problem. And you are absolutely right about encoding the data as JSON, saving it as a blob in the database. So is that clear? I'm assuming that answered your question, how I did that. So
Yeah, absolutely. I get something I was kind of building off of that. When doing something with Angular and using Blade, I know obviously there are conflicts and other stuff with like Blade templating and stuff.
yeah.
But I'm always questioning if I should either be returning the data with like Blade, or I should be loading Angular and then making a HTTP request to then get the data from the database to then echo out to the page type of thing.
Okay. Yeah, I'll show you an example of that. So whenever you first load the homepage of this itchin app, you actually don't see this happen, but it actually makes a request to this route right here, API version 1 generator, and you can see that's just returning a ton of JSON. I mean, there's literally a ton here. My computer's like lagging trying to scroll down. What you're seeing here is there's 100 places, so there's 10 places for each area of interest. That's an interesting point to bring this up. I actually pull 10 places for each area of interest because if you remember, you can have at most 10 itinerary items for a given area of interest. So I actually get that data right when I load this page, and then I don't have to make another call to the server. I can just switch out which itinerary items are being displayed based on how people are rating their preference for types of places to visit. So what I like to do, I don't know if you've used the UI router before. I find it to be really, really helpful for something like this. You can actually tell it to make an HTTP request and resolve the data and inject it into your controller before it actually loads the HTML. And then you can get rid of you don't have to use Blade, you don't have to use Laravel at all. Angular has taken over from that point on. So if we jump back to my router declaration really quick, which was in itgen module. I actually hid this before because I didn't want to show it at the moment, but this resolve argument that you can pass into a state of your application, what this is doing is it's creating a variable called places, and it's really just it's just a function, and I'm injecting another service I wrote called data service. Honestly, one of the hardest things I have is knowing when to abstract something into a service. I wish I had really great ideas of when you should do that. It's more of you just kind of have to play with it and you kind of learn that, okay, I need to abstract this away. But you can see that my data service right here has a function called get generator data, and this makes a GET request to the API version 1 generator route, and then when it's successful, it is adding all of that data into a places array on the data service, which is what's happening right here. And that data service is actually called by my generator service. As soon as my generator service is loaded, you can see that it requests data from the data service. So that ties back to never making another request back to the server. So my generator service has all the data that it needs to complete its function as soon as it's created, because it calls data from the data service, basically. But my router right here makes sure that all of that data is resolved before it allows Angular to build the view. So, and then what I'm doing right here is I'm actually moving some data around. I'm actually, if you were to look more closely at my data coming out of the database, you would see that terms are in basically an array of terms, and there can be more than one. And what I'm doing in my resolve statement is I'm actually just moving those into a tags array, which is immediately accessible. So I basically don't have to loop through go into it just makes it. I'm not explaining this very well at all because to be quite honest, I'm kind of maybe I should read my comments because I can't remember exactly why I did this, but yeah, push the items term onto the empty tags array. This makes it easier to search through a place's taxonomy terms because they are available at place.tags and they only contain the term name instead of all of the data for a term. So a term is also a model in my Laravel application, and you can see it relates to a taxonomy. It has a slug, it has created at, it has deleted at, all this stuff. In order to simplify searching through that on the Angular side, I actually, when I resolve that data in my router, I actually push it onto a tags array for that specific item. I hope that makes sense, but that's typically how I do it, is always resolve the data before you load the view, and then all of that, you can see that this places data is being returned here, and then I believe in my my controller, okay, yeah, it was, so what I did was I resolved all that data, I put it on my data service, and then my generator service requests the data from my data service, and then my generator service gets injected into my controllers, and then now I have access to all that data directly in my HTML. So it's a really long-winded way to tell you what I just did, but I want to make sure I'm being as clear as I can, so hopefully that answers that for you.
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you.
Okay, awesome.
Cool.
So,
I think we had some oh, go ahead, David.
yeah, I was just wondering why. Maybe you said it, but I just didn't hear it. Why you opted out of like using Laravel's default return type as JSON? You know, like it defaults Eloquent will return a JSON. Will return JSON.
Yeah.
But
yeah, that's what I'm doing here. If you notice that this is the function that actually pulls data out of the database, and this is what is responded to when you hit the itinerary. Let me show you. When you hit this route, obviously it's returning JSON.
mm-hmm.
And I wasn't too concerned with building an actual REST API for this app. You know, I didn't feel like I needed to do that. I could have extended this, but that's what I'm doing right here, is just returning a collection of places.
So I guess like the data in the database where it's the name and all the, I guess, properties. Yeah, if you pull that up.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not sure I know exactly what you're asking.
I was just wondering if there was like a specific use case or ease of use kind of reason for putting all the data in a blob versus just putting it all in columns. And
yeah, the only reason I would say, at least for itineraries, the reason I chose a blob here was I knew that I wouldn't really need to query itineraries based on their name or dates or anything like that.
mm-hmm.
Well, I actually have the dates over here, kind of when they're, well, that's not true because the date of arrival is different from when it's created. But the use case in this example was simply the fact that we would need, I'm trying to think of the best way to explain this. You would switch between itineraries, only your own itinerary. So there's no public view of an itinerary. Actually, there is I'm not explaining this well at all. There is actually a public view, but you would only share it with people. So it's not like someone would come to this site and we would just show them, hey, here are the 10 itineraries, the last 10 itineraries that have been generated. So the reason I saved it all in a blob was just I didn't know exactly if I would extend this data, and I didn't want to have to write a new migration to keep adding data to it. My math is actually not perfect, and there are times when I don't get 10 itineraries. I get less than that. And so I also wanted the ability to, what if they want to save 20 itinerary items instead of 10 now?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to have to modify the number of columns in my database, so it just made sense to store it all into a blob and just encode it in JSON, because I've got to repull this data anyway. So I didn't, I don't want, itinerary item 1, itinerary item 2, like 20 columns of that. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Or deal with pivot tables or anything like that. Or
Yeah, I mean, if I can, I had a lot of that actually going on already because of the structure of this. You can see that there's actually a small CMS built with this app too, and it's got places. Places have metadata. They have meta groups. They have taxonomies, and they have taxonomy terms. There's a lot of extra data that has to be loaded. So the fewer joins I have to do, even with Laravel's eager loading, I figured the better. So.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for answering that.
Cool.
Cool. So I think, does anybody else have any questions? I think Osvaldo, you had one, and Kobe asked one. Kobe, what was yours? You there, Kobe?
Hey, sorry. Chrome is lagging.
Hello.
Hey, so I'm the newbie in all of in this group. So I'm curious. I think this question kind of follows along with what David asked. Was where's the overlap in the capabilities of what you're using Angular for versus what you could have used Laravel for?
Yeah.
It's kind of more. That's like higher level, but.
Yeah, I could have built this entire app with Angular. With Laravel. You wouldn't have to do it with Angular. The reason I chose Angular was we wanted this really cool interface where you would begin to see different data as you dragged these bars around. And if I built it with just Laravel, you've got to use JavaScript at some point to have this kind of functionality, because if I use just Laravel, I would have to let someone rate all of their areas of interest and then submit the data to the server and then do something with it and then return it all. And I wanted to avoid that. I enjoy single page apps. I enjoy working with Angular too. So, but I mean, I think the smoothness of the UI is probably the main reason why you would choose to use a JavaScript framework over just building something like this in Laravel. Yeah, and we wanted people to play with this, or we did. Again, I don't actually work for this company anymore. I took another job. Between the time that I agreed to do this with Tanner and then actually was able to give this talk, I actually switched jobs. So I'm not working on it anymore, but the idea of just playing with this and seeing things happen as you're working with it was really important. And we just wanted to make that cool interface. I think it's just a little bit cooler for people to use a single page app as opposed to Laravel as just default Laravel. So and it is weird. I think the more you work with Angular, Angular has its own controllers, and then you end up writing controllers on Laravel, and you have to sanitize input as it's coming into Angular and before you post it to the server, and then you've got to sanitize it again on that side. So there is a lot of overlap between the two, and a lot of times when I'm working on these, I'm like, man, I'm writing controllers in Angular and now I'm doing it in Laravel, and it just seems kind of weird. And it's a paradigm shift you have to make when you start using Angular. And I actually have a couple more slides in my presentation to talk about the paradigm shifts that you have to make. And so we'll get to those. But really, in my experience, the use case for deciding on Angular over straight Laravel is primarily UI.
Yeah, it's almost like writing for like a local app.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a big shift, is that Angular is the source of truth as opposed to your server. And I think that's a big paradigm shift you have to make. I talk about it a little bit more here too. So cool.
Yeah, I think especially like if you're using a lot of JavaScript, it just really changes things. And so there's just an organization too. If you have to use a lot of JavaScript, or if you're doing especially a single page app, there just has to. I mean, it really comes under the requirements of the project or the the app that you're building, if it needs to be a single page app or not. And then from there, just decide whether to use vanilla Laravel or if you need to include any JavaScript framework, Angular, Ember, Backbone, whatever it is. So,
yeah.
Osvaldo, did you have something? Can you hear me, Osvaldo?
He's muted.
There you go.
Yeah, so the question is, when you specify modules in your application, do they get automatically loaded?
Yes, and if we look at my view file, look at global. Sorry, it's not where it is. It's in pages generator. At the very bottom, you see I'm calling these JavaScript files directly. So the generator controllers, generator service, I'm calling these directly. And if I jump back to them, what's happening is, of course, my itgen module declares the itgen app, and that's an Angular module. My controllers are itgen controllers, and that's an Angular module. And the fact that I'm calling them directly in the HTML, Angular is able to figure that out and load and share the data between those files. Sometimes sharing data between JavaScript files can be challenging, and so Angular really handles that for you. I hope that's clear. I don't know a better way to explain it. But
the question really is, does it actually load the files if you don't? Does it have like a AMD mechanism where it loads the files for modules if you don't?
If I didn't include these JavaScript files directly, could it figure out? Yeah, I don't think so. I think you know, it's smart enough to figure out that itgen requires these modules, but you still have to include the JavaScript file that declares those modules in your page, as far as I understand. It's not able to do anything else with that, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. If I have two other questions, does Angular have a CLI?
No, not that I'm aware of. I've never seen anything like that. I think what you end up doing is you're probably able to inspect. I mean, you can't really execute commands, I guess, but using console, you might be able to inspect specific things in your application for debugging and things like that. But as far as like actually giving Angular commands from a console, I'm not aware of anything like that.
Yeah, just wondering, because some JavaScript frameworks include some CLI commands for optimizing the application, but you can surely minify with you know,
with Grunt and things like that. Yeah,
with any of that, even CodeKit, something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, those were my questions. Thanks.
Okay, sweet.
Cool. We have one from let's see, it's in my email here. One from Miguel Garcia, and he asked, how are you detecting mobile using Laravel?
Oh yes, that's a really good question. I actually use a. Let's see if I have a good example here. I actually use a Laravel package, or really a composer package that someone else developed. I'll show you which one it is if I can remember. The itgen app uses it. Sorry, not itgen. Excuse me, that's the totally wrong project. The GPS app is what I meant. This one uses it, and it was the Jen Singers or Seegers. I don't know how you spell his name. It's called Agent. So we Google that. Here it is on GitHub, and this was really cool. It basically creates a facade for you, as I recall correctly. Yeah, so you can detect, you know, OS, and then is it mobile, is it tablet, and this is what I use. Basically, in my initial route, my homepage route in Laravel, I just detected using basically this exact function right here. is it a mobile or tablet device? And if it was, I just switched out which HTML which HTML view I loaded. That's a really complex example. Maybe in another talk. I know we're kind of maybe running out of time. I don't want to get too much into that, but I recommend this. It's worked really well. Laravel 4 user agent. You can probably Google that as well. It's worked for me, and I really liked it. So.
Wow, that's a really cool package. Hey, David, what have we used to connect agents, or do we at all?
At the music bed, we use the Laravel 4 user agent like that, and we're doing that on one of our newer projects to hide an HTML video background on mobile because it won't load automatically. So, yeah, it's very handy.
Yes, sir.
Sounds very cool. Well, cool. Does anybody? Man, it's like dark in my house now. Does anybody have any other questions? I don't have any others that have come in via the email. Who else is on here? I guess Ryan jumped out. Stuart or anybody have any other ones? Speak now, or forever hold your peace. Well, so I guess you have some kind of closing stuff, right?
Yeah, I have like 3 slides. They'll be really quick. So there's some paradigm shifts that I think you have to make when you start working with single-page apps, whether it's Ember or Angular. And the server is no longer the single source of truth. Because the server really just kind of receives data from Angular. What's happening in your Angular app is actually kind of your single source of truth. That's a little bit different than your typical Laravel app. And what I mean by that is things happen in your app, in your UI updates, and your users add data to your application before you save it to the server. So I really kind of view the server as a glorified hard drive whenever you're building like a single page app. Because really it's kind of there for persistence and maybe the initial page load to kind of determine if you're on a mobile device or not. So it's a very different way of thinking about things. Another piece of advice I would like to give is don't use jQuery in your Angular code to interact with the DOM. You'll want to try and use Angular directives in all cases, and the reason I say that is your UI can get out of sync if you start updating it with jQuery instead of using default Angular ways of doing things. I had that problem on that GPS app. Like there were ways that you could activate filters, but then you could deactivate them in other parts of the application. And instead of using Angular to figure out what the current active filters were and to make the UI respond to that, I was using jQuery to add and remove classes. And so I could not update parts of my app as I made changes because I was using jQuery to make changes. So try as hard. It's going to be really hard. You're going to want to do it, and I think you need to stay away from it as much as possible and work within the confines that Angular gives you, because you want to keep that data binding cycle always. That's your source of truth, not mucking with the DOM with jQuery. And the bottom 2 points kind of extend that a little bit more. jQuery, you'll want to fall back to it because you know it, and it's kind of a crutch of, okay, I just want to change a class on this element. Well, Angular actually has like an ng class directive. So what you'd want to do is evaluate an expression in that ng class directive and decide whether or not what classes should be applied to that element. What that lets you do is as your JavaScript layer changes, as people submit data or you act on data in your controller, your UI is automatically going to update itself because Angular is going to evaluate that expression and then apply the classes you tell it. I didn't have a great example of that in this case, but that is my biggest recommendation of you've got to start thinking that way of Angular interacts with the UI, not jQuery. You can use jQuery and Angular. They're not going to conflict with each other. I used it in this case for that date picker, but that was the only thing. I didn't actually use it in any of my Angular code. I think that's really important. And then I have some tips that I think are really important. I would not recommend using the built-in router. I think it's kind of limiting. So use the Angular UI router. I have a link to it there. And then a note about authenticating users. The GPS app, we actually authenticate people through Angular. We don't actually ever reload the page, which is kind of cool, but it was kind of a pain in the butt too. I recommend, if you can, to authenticate people through the normal Laravel process where they actually submit data to the server and all that stuff, and it refreshes and reloads the page, because I think that's easier. But if you, for some reason, don't want to do that, or you can't do it, or it's really cool not to do it, I have a package here that I think is really important, Laravel auth token. It basically will allow you to create a post request to a specific route on your controller, and it'll return a token. That token maps to a user, and it has like a public and private key system. It basically handles all of that for you, and you just have to check for the existence of that token in your Angular app. And I think you actually also post it back to the server, and it validates again, so people can't change it. Or if they change that app, or if they change that token in console or in the inspector, they'll get logged out of the application when they try and make a request. So I think
is that kind of like when you are logged out of Twitter, looking at a user's profile, and then you log in and it returns you to that profile page? Same idea?
Somewhat. I'm not sure exactly. This has to do primarily with. Are you talking about like when you log out, you go back to where you were in the app on Twitter, or?
You're already logged out, and then
Okay.
you log in, and it sends you right back to where you were.
No, that would probably be something different. That's just remembering where you were before you got caught by a login filter, and then redirecting you back to that. This is primarily about authenticating people in your application through Angular, so that they don't ever have to reload the page. So they're in your Angular app, they're not logged in, they see a specific state of the application, then you bring up a login form, they enter that data in, you through AJAX request, send that, you post that data back to the server, and then you receive a response and you authenticate them there, and you change whatever you need to in your application. I think there's a lot of security concerns about client-side authentication like that, so that's why I recommend doing it through normal Laravel if you can, but if you can't, use this package. And then Angular has other cool packages that people have written for them. Like there's one I used on the GPS app. I'll show you guys really quick. And if I try to submit data to the application without being logged in, and I'm actually not logged in here, you'll notice right up here like a growl notification came up. You must be logged in to share a story. That's provided by a third-party package. I didn't have to write any of that logic. What that package does is it listens to requests in and out of Angular, and if any request comes in on a specific HTTP code and it has a messages array, it automatically displays that data in Angular, and then it handles also expiring that data here in a second too. So that was a whole huge chunk of this application, sending feedback back to the user that I didn't have to write. All I did was I think I just searched like Angular, of course if I could type, Angular growl maybe, yeah, and I found a GitHub, so growl-like notifications for AngularJS projects, and then this walks you through like installation, how to put it in your project, and then so you just declare a module, and so your app actually depends on the Angular growl module, and then it tells you how you can use it to send messages to the user from your Angular application. So it was a really useful, there's lots of little packages like this for Angular, so I really like it. Okay, jumping back here. And that was really my last note there, was that people write cool Angular packages and you can use them, and I highly recommend doing that. And then there are two videos, and maybe I can ask Taylor how to post these links the best way. These are two videos created by a guy named Dave Mosher. And if you struggled at all with my talk, these are screencasts he did, and he did it in real time, walking you through Angular and then a Laravel application with Angular. Now, he uses the default Angular router, as I recall, but you'll get the basics down by watching these two videos. I really struggled. I watched these two videos, and it just opened up for me. So I highly recommend it. Also on Twitter, he's D Mosher. He's a cool guy. I highly recommend his information if you're interested in learning a little bit more about Angular and working with Angular with Laravel. These two videos are just awesome. They're free. They're on YouTube. They're screencasts. They're about 45 minutes to an hour. I can't recommend them enough. So we'll get those links posted somewhere so that you guys can look at them. And then that is basically it.
That's awesome. Cool. I guess we'll post those links somewhere. And I need to turn on the light in here because it's. Oh no! Looks like the lamp's way over there. Okay. Yeah, well, that's great. Did somebody? I think somebody spoke up. Did anybody else have a last question before we kind of get off of here? Cool. Well, I think that's it. So, hey, John, why don't you post those links on the Meetup group?
Okay.
So if anybody's watching this now, or if you are a time traveler from the future, watching this on YouTube, go to meetup.com and search for Laravel DFW, and then you'll find this one. It's August 7th, 2014, and John Fischelli, and then you'll find comments there with links. So we'll link to some great videos and stuff, and hopefully you guys have learned a lot. Be sure to keep in touch. Always post questions on Meetup. If you have anything or you need help, or ping me on Twitter. It's at Tanner Hearn. Or hit any of these guys up on Twitter for that matter. And then we'll just keep going. So I can't think of anything else that we need to do. So thank you guys for making it out, and we will see you next month.
Great, man.
Thanks, guys.
Peace.
Thanks, John.
Yeah.
Thanks, John.